Reasonableness, of course, is the fifth and final element of the 5 elements of self-defense. This is a slide I prepared for the Colorado Public Defenders annual meeting where I was invited as a speaker. You'll notice there's only 4 elements on here. The element of avoidance is not listed because Colorado is a hard stand-your-ground state. So there is no requirement to retreat. There is no legal element of avoidance in an otherwise lawful case of self-defense. So that's why there's only 4 elements here. But reasonableness is the one I was discussing at this point in the presentation. And of course, reasonableness is, it's kind of an umbrella element that sits over everything else. Everything you perceive, everything you decide, everything you do has to be reasonable. And reasonableness is evaluated from 2 perspectives. One, you need to have a subjective, genuine, good faith belief in the need to act in self-defense. But that alone is not enough. Your subjective belief is not enough. It also needs to be objectively reasonable, meaning that a reasonable and prudent person in your circumstances would have shared that subjective belief. To put it another way, your subjective belief can't be irrational. It can't be speculative. It can't be imaginative. It has to be based on facts, evidence, things you're observing, to which you're applying your powers of reason to come to a conclusion. So it can't be, well, for all I know, he could have had a gun. He could have had a knife. No, you need to see actual evidence. And here, of course, the observations are the preceding by this aggressor here, the hand in the pocket in the doorway, the return to the fight, the stabbing-like motions. This is not a speculative threat. He's not simply imagining that this guy may be acting in a dangerous manner. He's acting in a dangerous manner based on actual observations that you're making. And what controls here, the controlling legal question, is not whether the aggressor actually presents as a deadly force threat, but whether they reasonably appear to present as a deadly force threat. So in the Colorado Public Defender's Office conference, I was addressing this. So here we have reasonableness requiring both a subjective and objective component. I already discussed those with all of you, and you do need both. If you're missing either subjective or objective reasonableness, you don't have the element of reasonableness, and there's no such thing as unreasonable self-defense. So if you lack the element of reasonableness, it's a required element of self-defense. You lose reasonableness, you lose self-defense. There's no justification for your use of force. And then I showed the Colorado Public Defenders in the audience, the relevant statute that refers to reasonably believes. For both, this is for non-deadly force, paragraph 1 of 18-1704, paragraph 2 of that same statute refers to deadly force. And I talked a bit about how it's not necessary that the defender be correct in his evaluation of the threat. It's sufficient for lawful self-defense that he reasonably perceived the deadly force threat in order to justify his use of deadly defensive force. We're not required to make perfect decisions in self-defense. We're required to make reasonable decisions. And I illustrated this with a number of cases. And the cases I used were cases where a suspect had pointed an apparent gun at law enforcement and, not surprisingly, got shot. And in these cases, got killed. And the examples I used, the guns were generally BB guns that were built to resemble actual firearms. So when these real-looking guns were pointed at law enforcement reasonably perceived a deadly force threat, and they responded appropriately with deadly defensive force. Now, was there a deadly force threat? No. These were not actual firearms being pointed at police. Does that matter? No. What matters is the officer's perception, reasonable perception of a deadly force threat. This is one of the cases. I picked this one because it had happened in Denver, Colorado, just a few miles from where the Colorado Public Defender's annual meeting was being held when I gave this talk in June of 2023. And the suspect pointed the facsimile, the replica H&K pistol on the left at police and was shot and killed. Sadly, he was 14 years old. But 14-year-olds kill each other all the time in America, and they kill cops too. So he pointed that facsimile gun at the police, and they returned fire, deadly force. and killed him. Was he actually presenting a deadly force threat to the police? No. Does that matter? No. What matters is whether the officers reasonably perceived he was presenting a deadly force threat. And there on the right, you can see what the actual H&K pistol looks like, that this facsimile was designed to replicate. In the heat of the moment, would you be able to distinguish the difference? Another case, I chose this one because it was even more recent to the Public Defender's Annual Conference. This one was in Fresno, California, but it was in July of 2023. The suspect pointed the pistol on the left at police. That's a BB gun. The pistol on the right is the actual version of this firearm. They're indistinguishable from each other, folks. Again, sadly, this was a 15-year-old. Tragic. Was not actually presenting a deadly force threat to the police, but that's not what matters. He was reasonably perceived as presenting a deadly force threat to police, and they appropriately responded with deadly defensive force. The third case I picked was not recent, but it was very high profile. So I wanted to, I pick all these real world cases, folks. So the legal points I'm making are more concrete. They're not just academic and hypothetical. Right? Make sense? This one I picked because it was very high profile. I wasn't sure if the people in the audience might have heard of the other two cases. They were not nearly as high profile, but I felt that it was likely they would have heard of this one. Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio. He tragically was 13 years old. A big 13 years old. He was 200 pounds. And he had been walking around a park, pointing an apparent gun at people. Tamir Rice happened to be black. He was pointing the gun at other black people in a park, and they called police. And when police came to the scene, Tamir Rice reached for the apparent gun in his waistband. The gun he had was the gun on top. And of course, all the police would have seen would have been the grip because it was tucked in Tamir's waistband when he reached for it. On the bottom, we have the actual version of that pistol. Really indistinguishable. In fact, the police chief of Cleveland, Ohio at the time, who happens to be African-American, gave a press conference where he himself said the facsimile firearm was indistinguishable from a real gun. So those are the examples I used.